Picture the blazing summer sun over the valley of Olympia more than 2,000 years ago. The air is thick with dust, the murmur of thousands of voices rising like waves as crowds from every corner of Greece gather to witness something extraordinary. Merchants shout above the din, musicians play shrill flutes, and heralds call out the names of athletes about to risk everything for eternal fame. Barefoot runners stamp the packed earth. Wrestlers oil their bodies until they glisten, and charioteers tighten their grip on reins, their horses restless with anticipation. The ancient Olympic Games were not just competitions, they were moments of glory, spectacles of pride, and, hidden beneath the surface, stories of scandal and secrecy that history rarely tells. To win here was to achieve immortality. No medals were handed out, no riches guaranteed. A victor received nothing more than a wreath of olive leaves and the unshakable glory of being remembered for centuries. Yet behind the triumphs lay rivalries between city-states, schemes for influence, and scandals that revealed the games were never as pure as the poets claimed. The Olympics were stages for politics as much as athletics, places where reputations were made, empires were honored, and sometimes rules were quietly broken. Tonight we will journey into the hidden world of the ancient Olympics. We will see how they began, how athletes trained and suffered, how victories were celebrated and manipulated, and how scandals shaped the games as much as glory did. This is not only the story of running and wrestling, it is the story of pride, power, and the strange mix of beauty and corruption that made the ancient Olympic Games unforgettable. Welcome to Boring History. For sleep, if you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let us step quietly into Olympia and uncover the secrets, the glory, and the scandals of the world's first great games. Imagine the dust of a summer day more than 27 centuries ago. The Valley of Olympia, alive with the sound of voices, footsteps, and anticipation. There are no stadiums of stone yet, no grand marble monuments, only a simple track marked. On the earth, a gathering of people beneath the open sky, and a sense that something important is about to begin. Men from distant towns and scattered city-states have traveled for days, even weeks, to arrive here. They have come not only to compete, but to witness, to share in an event that will bind them together in ways that ordinary life could not. The first Olympic Games were not born fully formed as we imagine them today. They began as something far, humbler, yet their impact would ripple across centuries, transforming not only athletics but identity, politics, and memory itself. The earliest gatherings at Olympia were simple, unadorned affairs. Athletes competed barefoot, their bodies lean from farming and daily labor rather than polished training regimens. The contests were direct running across a straight track, wrestling with sheer strength and skill, testing endurance against others of equal ambition. Victors received no great riches, no glittering prizes. Instead, they earned a wreath woven from the branches of a sacred olive tree, and with it, a fame that extended far beyond the dusty track. To win was to prove oneself not just to one's fellow competitors, but to entire cities. Stories of victory spread by word of mouth, carried by travelers, sung by poets, and remembered for generations. Yet the significance of the games was never only about sport. To the people who first gathered at Olympia, it was a rare and extraordinary moment of peace. City-states often fought with one another, rivalries ran deep, and conflicts scarred the land. But when the games approached, truces were declared, conflicts paused, and men who might otherwise have faced one another on the battlefield now met on the track. This truce gave the games a weight that transcended athletics. It was not merely a competition. It was a shared ritual of identity, an affirmation that even in times of division, there were moments when unity could prevail. As years passed, the games grew in scope and prestige. Word of Olympia spread, and with it came more participants, more spectators, and more ambition. The contests expanded beyond simple running to include wrestling, boxing, long jump, discus, and the brutal pancration where almost anything was permitted short of death. Chariot races brought thunderous excitement as horses and drivers hurtled around tracks, their fates tied to skill and chance alike. Each event demanded not only physical ability but resilience, for conditions were harsh, the heat unrelenting, and the challenges severe. Victors bore scars as proudly as crowns. Their names were etched into memory not by monuments of stone, but by the voices of those who carried their stories home. But the games were never untouched by politics. From the very beginning, city-states recognized their value as stages for prestige. To send athletes was to declare one's vitality. To win was to claim superiority. To host or to patronize was to display influence. Victors often returned home to be celebrated as heroes, receiving privileges that lasted a lifetime, meals at the public expense, front seats at festivals, and the enduring admiration of neighbors. Their victories became civic victories woven into the pride of their cities. Thus, the games were never only personal, they were communal, political, and symbolic. The birth of the games also revealed the earliest glimpses of scandal and rivalry. Accusations of cheating, bribery, and manipulation were recorded even in those early years. Some athletes sought to bend the rules, some officials accepted favors, and some victories were clouded by suspicion. Yet these very scandals remind us that the games were not abstract ideals, but human endeavors shaped by ambition, greed, and imperfection. They were alive with the same mix of glory and flaw that characterizes all great human institutions. What made the ancient Olympics unique was the way they grew from modest beginnings into something vast while retaining their core symbolism. At their heart was always the notion that to compete was to touch something greater than oneself, that to run on the track at Olympia was to join a lineage stretching into eternity. This idea gave the games a mythic aura, even as reality revealed dust, sweat, and human imperfection. The athletes of those early gatherings could not have imagined how far their contests would echo. But each footstep on that packed earth carried the weight of history yet to come. As we reflect on the birth of the Olympic Games, we see not a single moment of creation, but a slow unfolding. Simple contests grew into elaborate spectacles, modest gatherings into international events of their age. What began as a truce-bound festival in a valley of Greece became a tradition that outlasted kingdoms and empires. Even as centuries passed, even as the games themselves changed, their essence, the pursuit of glory, the promise of fame, the thrill of competition remained constant. And so, when we imagine those earliest days, we should not see marble stadiums or vast crowds. We should see dust rising in the sun, hear the sound of bare feet striking the earth, feel the anticipation of men about to test themselves before neighbors and rivals alike. We should imagine wreaths of olive leaves placed gently on the heads of victors and the quiet pride of those who returned home carrying nothing but memory and honor. That was how it began, humbly, powerfully, and with a resonance that continues even now. Imagine the roads of ancient Greece in the height of summer, dusty tracks winding between olive groves and rocky hillsides, the heat shimmering in the distance as groups of travelers make their way toward the same destination. Some are athletes, with lean, disciplined bodies, carrying little more than cloaks and determination. Others are merchants with carts full of goods, eager to sell food, oil, and trinkets to the swelling crowds. Still others are families, pilgrims, and curious onlookers traveling for days or even weeks, simply to be part of something greater than themselves. The journey to Olympia was more than physical. It was symbolic. To walk those roads was to take part in a ritual that transcended daily life, to step into a tradition that promised both spectacle and belonging. The athletes often began their journeys months in advance. Selected by their city-states, they were not merely individuals but representatives, carrying the pride of entire communities on their shoulders. Training had prepared them long runs at dawn, endless hours of wrestling practice, drills with discus and javelin, but the journey itself was another test. Roads were rough, supplies limited, and travel slow. Yet each mile brought them closer to Olympia, to the sacred valley where their skills would be tested before crowds larger than any they had ever seen. Along the way, they met fellow competitors, men from rival cities who exchanged glances filled with both camaraderie and rivalry. These encounters turned dusty roads into preludes of competition, with every step echoing the anticipation of the games to come. Spectators, too, made the journey with enthusiasm. For many, it was the event of a lifetime, a chance to see the strongest, fastest, and most skilled men of their age gathered in one place. Farmers left fields untended, craftsmen paused their work, and families packed provisions to travel in groups. The journey was slow, filled with stops in villages where travelers shared stories and rumors about who might win, about which city's athletes were favored, about scandals from past games still whispered on the road. The closer they grew to Olympia, the larger the crowds became, streams of travelers converging like rivers toward the same destination. Merchants seized the opportunity with equal vigor. Caravans loaded with wine, olives, bread, oil, and meat joined the procession, for the games were not only contests of athletes, but festivals of commerce. At Olympia, stalls would spring up like miniature cities, offering food and drink, souvenirs, charms, and necessities for weary travelers. The journey itself became a moving marketplace, with merchants shouting their wares to passing groups, eager to profit from the excitement. The arrival at Olympia was breathtaking. After days of dusty travel, the valley opened before the eyes of the pilgrims and athletes. Fields surrounded by hills, the river Alpheus winding through, and the grounds prepared for the games. Simple as it was, the sight carried weight. Here, for days to come, the ordinary world would pause, and a new world would form one of contests, rituals, and shared experience. Travelers entered with awe, aware that they were stepping into something ancient, something larger than themselves. The roads themselves became part of the tradition. Stories of journeys survived long after victories were forgotten. Tales were told of athletes who trained even while walking, practicing their strides on dusty paths, wrestling in fields when resting overnight. Stories of pilgrims described the joy of traveling in groups, singing songs, sharing food, and meeting strangers who became companions. For many, the journey was as important as the games, a rare chance to leave home and be part of a collective adventure that would be remembered for years. The journey also revealed the diversity of Greece itself. City-states differed in accent, dress, and custom, yet at Olympia they came together in a rare display of unity. The roads converging on the valley became veins of connection, carrying people who might never otherwise have met into shared experience. Travelers marveled at the accents of others, the styles of clothing, the different foods they carried. These encounters widened horizons, turning the games into not only athletic contests, but cultural exchanges, places where Greece discovered itself. Not all journeys were easy. Heat was merciless. Bandits lurked along some routes, and provisions ran out. Yet the determination to reach Olympia outweighed the difficulties. Even those who traveled only to watch believed the hardship worth it, for the reward was to stand among thousands, to see athletes test themselves, to cheer, to marvel, to belong. The journey was sacrifice and investment, a sign of how deeply the games mattered. As night falls and you rest, imagine the roads of ancient Greece once more. Picture lines of travelers moving slowly across hills, their footsteps raising dust into the air. Hear the murmur of conversations, the laughter of companions, the occasional clash of athletes sparring as they rest. Smell the food carried in baskets, the leather of sandals worn thin, the faint smoke of fires lit along the roadside. Then imagine the moment of arrival when the valley of Olympia comes into view and the long journey ends in wonder. The games are about to begin, but even before the contests, the journey itself has already bound thousands together in memory and anticipation. Imagine the valley of Olympia alive with the sound of thousands of voices, the air heavy with heat, the ground packed hard from countless footsteps. Dust rises in clouds as men crowd the simple stadium, a long stretch of earth marked by nothing more than carved stones at either end. There are no towering stands, no marble seats, yet just sloping hillsides where spectators sit shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the contests to begin. The arena is plain, even humble, but in the eyes of those gathered, it is a place of transformation, where ordinary men will test themselves in front of the world and emerge either forgotten or immortalized. The dust, the sweat, the cries of the crowd all combine to make the arena not merely a place of sport, but a stage upon which human endurance is revealed in its rawest form. The races begin with silence. Athletes stripped to simple garments, or nothing at all, standing barefoot at the starting line carved into the earth. Their bodies glisten with oil, muscles tense with anticipation. The herald's voice rises, calling for stillness, and then at the signal they surge forward, feet pounding against the packed dirt. Dust sprays into the air, lungs heave, and the crowd roars. The sprint, the stadium race, is short but merciless. To stumble is to be forgotten. To finish first is to etch one's name into memory. These runners are not cushioned by tracks or modern shoes. Every stride jars the bones. Every breath pulls in dust. Victory comes not only from speed but from resilience, from the ability to ignore pain and strain until the finish stone is reached. But the arena is not only for runners. Wrestling matches soon follow, and here the dust rises thicker still. Men coat themselves in oil and then sprinkle fine sand to improve their grip. They crouch low, eyes locked, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The silence before the clash is tense, broken only by the mutter of the crowd. Then they lunge, bodies slamming together with a force that echoes across the arena. They grapple, twist, and strain, muscles quivering, feet digging furrows into the ground. Each throw sends up clouds of dust, each fall greeted by cheers or groans from the crowd. Victory is not given lightly. An opponent must be thrown to the ground 3 times before triumph is declared. It is a contest of strength, yes, but also of patience, strategy, and endurance. The crowd watches as men strain against each other in a primal struggle, their bodies marked with scratches, their breath ragged, their faces set with determination. Other contests push endurance even further. Boxing is brutal, with fists wrapped in leather thongs that turn hands into weapons. Each blow lands with a crack, raising welts, splitting lips, drawing gasps from the spectators. There are no rounds, no limits. The fight continues until one man cannot stand or admits defeat. Blood mixes with dust. Sweat stings eyes, yet still they fight, driven by pride, ambition, and the desperate hunger for victory. The pack ration goes further, still a contest, where almost anything is permitted. Men strike, grapple, choke, and bend limbs in a battle that tests not only strength, but the will to endure. It is a test of body and spirit pushed to the edge, watched with both awe and uneased by the crowd. The arena is filled with more than athletes. It is filled with sound. The roar of approval when a runner surges ahead. The collective gasp when a wrestler slams his opponent. The cries of encouragement from fellow citizens cheering their representatives. Merchants shout from stalls, children climb for better views, elders murmur judgments on technique. The games are not silent rituals, but living spectacles, alive with voices and emotion. Yet at their heart, in the dust and sweat, is the quiet endurance of the athletes themselves, each man alone in his contest, each striving for a victory that will outlast the noise of the day. Endurance is the thread that binds all contests together. To run under a blazing sun, to wrestle until muscles fail, to box until sight blurs, to fight until limbs tremble each demands not only skill, but the ability to endure pain, heat, and exhaustion. The dust of Olympia clings to every competitor, a reminder that glory is not won easily, that the path to fame is marked by struggle. The victors are not merely the strongest or the fastest. They are the ones who endure longer, who refuse to yield when their bodies cry out for rest. The arena, humble though it may seem, becomes the heart of the games. Here reputations are forged, heroes born, and stories created that will be told for generations. The dust settles after each contest, footprints erased by the next, but the memory remains. To have stood in that arena, to have tested oneself against rivals and been seen by thousands, is to have touched immortality in its simplest form. As night falls and the crowds disperse, the arena lies quiet once more. The dust settles back into the earth, the marks of struggle fade, and silence returns. Yet in the minds of those who watched, the images remain, runners straining toward the finish, wrestlers locked in struggle, boxers exchanging blows, man enduring beyond expectation. These memories will be carried home, told in markets and homes, sung by poets, preserved in stories that will outlast the very games themselves. And so the arena of dust, humble and raw, becomes eternal, not because of stone or monument, but because of the endurance of those who fought upon it. Imagine the thunder of hooves shattering the quiet of Olympia, dust exploding from the ground as teams of horses surge forward, their manes flying, their eyes wild with strain. Charioteers, clad in simple tunics, grip the reins with white knuckles, their voices hoarse as they shout commands, trying to hold control over beasts that weigh far more than any man. Wheels rattle, wood creaks, and the crowd roars as the chariots lean dangerously around the curves of the hippodrome. It is chaos and spectacle, danger and beauty, bound together in a single contest. Unlike the simple foot races or the brutal wrestling matches, the chariot race was something entirely different, something that spoke of wealth, ambition, and the strange extremes of the ancient Olympic Games. The chariot races were not contests of raw muscle alone. They were demonstrations of resources. To compete, one had to own or sponsor horses to afford the care and training required for such powerful animals. For this reason, the victors were often not the drivers themselves, but the wealthy patrons who financed them. Women who could not directly compete in most Olympic contests found in chariot racing a loophole. They could sponsor teams, and when their horses won, their names were recorded as victors. This rare opening allowed them to achieve recognition in a world otherwise dominated by men, and it added to the uniqueness of the event. Yet for all its prestige, the race was perilous. Horses collided, chariots overturned, and drivers were dragged along the ground, bones breaking beneath the weight of the wheels. Victories were celebrated, but failures often ended in tragedy. The spectacle of the hippodrome drew enormous crowds, for it was unpredictable and thrilling. Unlike foot races, where a stumble or a slower stride decided outcomes quickly, the chariot race could turn in an instant. A leader might dominate for laps only to lose everything in a single crash. The danger made it captivating, the roar of the crowd rising with each sharp turn, each near miss, each wreck that sent splinters flying. To witness such a contest was to feel the raw edge of human daring, wealth, and ambition played out upon a track that cared nothing for status or skill. But the Olympic Games were not limited to races and combat alone. Some events now seem unusual, even strange, reflecting a world with different priorities and values. The pentathlon combined running, discus, javelin, long jump, and wrestling, a test not of one skill, but of many. Athletes leapt with lead weights in their hands, swinging them forward as they jumped to gain distance, a method both practical and odd to modern eyes. In discus, they spun heavy stones or bronze discs, their movements graceful yet dangerous, for a misthrow could strike the watching crowd. The javelin was thrown not only for distance, but with a thong of leather looped around the shaft, adding spin and accuracy, a detail long forgotten until scholars pieced it back together. Each event, familiar yet strange, carried echoes of both practicality and ritual, merging athletic skill with techniques that seem curious now. Dot boxing and pankration, though brutal, had their own unusual qualities. Fighters bound their hands, not with padded gloves, but with strips of leather hardened by sweat and time, turning each fist into a weapon capable of cutting flesh. There were no timed rounds, no limits on punishment. Matches lasted until one man could no longer rise. The pankration, combining wrestling and striking, permitted almost anything, from holds and locks to choking and crushing. To modern sensibilities, these contests seem savage, but to the ancients they represented the ultimate test of endurance, courage, and willpower. The unusual nature lay not only in the violence, but in the endurance of it, the expectation that men could withstand more than we might imagine possible today. There were also contests tied to animals beyond horses. Mule cart races, though less glamorous than chariot races, were once included, their clumsy unpredictability drawing laughter and cheers. The image of stubborn animals dragging carts along a track, drivers urging them with shouts and whips, gave the games a peculiar, almost comedic spectacle, a reminder that not all events were lofty displays of skill, but sometimes playful or experimental. Over time, these stranger contests faded, leaving behind traces and records that surprise us centuries later. The uniqueness of these events reveals something deeper about the Olympic Games. They were not frozen in form but evolving, adapting to the interests and ambitions of the people who shaped them. Some events highlighted wealth and status, others pure strength, others a mix of skill and cunning. Together, they created a program that reflected the complexity of ancient Greek life, its hierarchies, its risks, its fascination with both beauty and brutality. The dust of Olympia held the memory of all these unusual contests. The roar of chariots, the leap of athletes with weights in their hands, the crash of discus in the distance, the cries of boxers locked in endless struggle all blended into the atmosphere of the games. Spectators marveled, cheered, gasped, and sometimes recoiled, but always they remembered. Victors carried glory home, their names preserved in records and stories, while the events themselves lingered as proof that the games were more than sport. They were theater, ritual, and society, distilled into spectacle. As you drift toward rest tonight, imagine once more the unusual events of Olympia. Picture the chariots surging forward, wheels rattling, horses straining with every stride. See the athletes leaping with stones in their hands, discus spinning through the air, javelins whistling across the field. Hear the cries of boxers exchanging, endless blows, the thud of wrestlers colliding, the laughter of crowds watching mule carts stumble across the track. In all these sounds and sights lies the essence of the games: glory, strangeness, and the eternal fascination of human competition in its rawest form. Imagine a quiet courtyard in the early hours of dawn, the air still cool before the Mediterranean sun begins its relentless climb. In the dust and silence, figures move: young men, stripped to the waist, their bodies glistening with oil, their muscles tense with the strain of repeated drills. One sprints barefoot across the packed earth, each stride measured and precise. Another hurls a heavy discus again and again, his arm aching, but his movements growing sharper. A pair of wrestlers circle each other, feet grinding furrows into the dirt, their breath steady and focused as they practice holds they will need when the crowd roars in Olympia. These scenes were the unseen half of the Olympic Games, the relentless training that shaped ordinary men into figures of strength, speed, and endurance capable of glory under the eyes of thousands. Training for the ancient games was not a pastime, but a discipline. Athletes often lived apart from their families for months, dedicating themselves entirely to preparation. They entered gymnasia, spaces designed not only for exercise but for routine, repetition, and the forging of resilience. Coaches oversaw them, harsh and unyielding, demanding more from their bodies each day. The regimen was exhausting: hours of running under the sun, drills in wrestling pits filled with sand, exercises with javelins and weights, endless repetitions until muscle memory replaced hesitation. To outsiders it may have looked monotonous, but to the athletes it was a sacred path to immortality. Every bead of sweat, every aching muscle, every bruise was an investment in the chance to be remembered forever. The training began with the body itself. Athletes learned to care for their strength with strict diets, eating simple foods that fueled endurance: bread, cheese, olives, figs, and meat when it could be spared. They drank wine diluted with water, never too much, never enough, to dull their sharpness. Meals were not feasts, but fuel, measured and timed to support performance. Oil played a central role, rubbed into the skin before training to protect and invigorate, scraped away afterward with curved strigils that carried with them sweat, dust, and fatigue. These routines, repeated daily, bound body and mind into discipline, reminding each athlete that preparation was as much about patience as it was about effort. Running was among the most fundamental drills. Athletes ran short sprints until their lungs burned, then long distances until their legs trembled. They practiced starts at carved stones, learning to launch themselves forward in unison with others. They ran barefoot, their soles toughened by dust and stone, their strides sharpened by repetition. Endurance came slowly, built through weeks of effort, forged in pain and persistence. When the day of competition came, a runner was not surprised by the heat or the dust. He had lived with both for months. His body knew the rhythm of breathing, the balance of speed, the resilience needed to endure. Wrestlers trained differently, their bodies hardened by countless falls and grapples. They coated themselves in oil and sand, practicing grips, throws, and holds. Matches and training were no less brutal than those before crowds, for coaches demanded realism and effort. Wrestlers learned not only strength but strategy, when to strike, when to wait, when to feint, and when to commit. They repeated drills until their bodies reacted without thought, until each movement was instinct. Bruises, scratches, and strained muscles were not setbacks but signs of progress. To become a victor in Olympia, a wrestler had to endure more in training than he would in the contest itself. Boxers and pancration fighters subjected themselves to even harsher regimens. They toughened their fists by striking posts wrapped in leather, their knuckles hardening with each blow. They practiced endurance by sparring for long stretches, learning to withstand pain, to remain calm under assault, to find openings even when exhausted. Pancration fighters trained every part of their bodies, for in their contests almost anything was allowed: striking, grappling, choking, crushing. Their preparation demanded both versatility and resilience, a willingness to suffer in training so that in the arena they could push beyond limits. The training was not only physical but mental. Athletes learned focus, discipline, and patience. Coaches drilled into them the importance of composure, of not allowing nerves or arrogance to disrupt performance. Victors were not always the strongest. They were the most disciplined, the most resilient, the most prepared for the unique demands of the games. Hours spent repeating the same motions, days filled with the same routines, forged minds as steady as bodies. When thousands watched, When the dust rose and the crowd roared, an athlete's training allowed him to act without hesitation, to trust in habits forged by months of effort. What is most striking about these regimens is the simplicity of tools and the depth of commitment. There were no machines, no elaborate equipment, only earth, stone, wood, and the body itself. Yet from these simple means, extraordinary athletes emerged, capable of feats that astonished crowds and secured eternal fame. The discipline was in the repetition, the endurance in the refusal to yield. Victors were forged not in moments of triumph, but in the endless days of preparation that no crowd ever saw. As you rest tonight, imagine once more the courtyards and training grounds of ancient Greece. See runners sprinting across dusty tracks, wrestlers grappling in pits of sand, boxers striking posts with fists wrapped in leather. Hear the steady rhythm of breath, the sharp commands of coaches, the quiet determination of men who endure day after day for a chance at a single victory. Picture the oil glistening on their skin, the strigils scraping away fatigue, the simple meals that fueled them. These images remind us that behind every moment of glory in Olympia lay months of struggle, unseen by the crowd but essential to this story. The training regimens were not glamorous, but they were the true foundation of glory, relentless, demanding, and unforgettable. Imagine the Valley of Olympia filled not just with athletes and spectators, but with the banners, accents, and rivalries of dozens of independent city-states, each one proud, each one eager to prove itself on the grandest stage of their world. From Athens came men trained in discipline and strategy. From Sparta came warriors hardened by a lifetime of endurance. From Corinth came competitors backed by wealth and ambition. And from smaller towns came those desperate to show that even the humblest polis could produce greatness. To the casual spectator, the Olympic Games were about athletics and spectacle. But to the cities of Greece, they were stages upon which politics, pride, and prestige played out in ways as important as any battle. The contests in the arena were physical, but beneath them lay a deeper contest of reputation, identity, and influence. The city-states of Greece lived in constant rivalry. They fought wars, formed alliances, betrayed one another, and competed for trade and power. Yet every 4 years they sent their best to Olympia, not with weapons, but with athletes. Victories won here were not private triumphs. They were public declarations. When an Athenian runner claimed the wreath, it was Athens itself that basked in glory. When a Spartan wrestler threw all challengers to the ground, it was Sparta's discipline and toughness that shone. Victors became symbols, proof of their city's superiority in strength, culture, or endurance. Crowds cheered not only for athletes, but for the places they represented, turning the games into peaceful battlegrounds where reputations were forged, not politics, seeped into every corner of Olympia. Delegations from city-states set up tents and pavilions, displaying their wealth with carved statues, bright banners, and lavish gifts. These were not only for show, but for persuasion, attempts to win allies, to impress rivals, to display influence. Olympia itself became a marketplace of politics, where treaties were discussed in the shade, where envoys met quietly while the crowd roared for runners. Victories in the arena often influenced negotiations outside it, for success in athletics suggested strength in all things. Cities that produced victors gained prestige. Cities that failed too often risked being seen as weak. For Sparta, the games were natural extensions of their way of life. Their athletes, raised and disciplined from childhood, embodied their cities. Values of toughness, endurance, and dominance. To see a Spartan crowned victor was to confirm what many already believed, that Sparta's way of life bred the strongest men. For Athens, the games were occasions to display not only athletic skill, but cultural superiority. Poets sang of Athenian victors, sculptors carved their likenesses, and the city ensured that the world remembered their triumphs in art and word. Corinth and other wealthy cities used their resources to sponsor chariot races, contests that required not strength alone, but horses, stables, and wealth. Here the politics of class revealed itself, for victors were often patrons rather than drivers. Their glory earned not through sweat, but through sponsorship. Yet the games also offered smaller, city-states opportunities to rise above their stature. A single victor could bring honor to a town otherwise unnoticed, lifting its reputation for years. Stories tell of men from obscure places whose victories echoed far beyond their borders, proving that glory was not the privilege of great cities alone. This democratizing power of the games made them both inspiring and dangerous, for it allowed prestige to shift unexpectedly, altering balances of pride and influence. Scandals, too, reflected politics. Accusations of bribery or cheating were rarely isolated acts of individuals. They often involved the pressure of cities desperate for victory. Some athletes were said to have been bribed to lose, others to have been supported with questionable advantages. Officials punished these acts, erecting statues of Zeus paid for by fines as warnings, but the persistence of scandal revealed how deeply politics ran beneath the contests. Cities wanted glory, and in their hunger for it, they sometimes pushed athletes beyond fairness that the rewards given to victors also highlighted politics. While the crown of olive leaves was the official prize, cities often showered their champions with gifts, free meals for life, front row seats at festivals, exemptions from taxes, even monuments in their honor. These were not just rewards, but investments, for each victor became a living emblem of the city's greatness. When a man walked through Athens wearing his wreath, it was Athens itself that shone brighter. When a Spartan returned victorious, the city celebrated as if a battle had been won. The athletes carried not only their own names, but the reputations of their homelands, and the politics of recognition shaped every celebration. Even the truce that allowed safe passage to Olympia was political. Cities agreed to suspend conflicts, but the enforcement of this peace was fragile. Some violated it, seeking advantage in war, while others honored tradition. The very fact that such truces were necessary shows how the games existed in tension. between unity and rivalry. Olympia was a place where Greece came together, but also a place where divisions were displayed. Athletes from rival cities glared at one another. Victories sharpened resentments, and cheers for one city were often jeers for another dot. As the centuries passed, the political role of the games only grew. Victors were immortalized, not just in local memory but in pan-Hellenic fame, their names sung across the Greek world. Cities built treasuries at Olympia, lavish buildings filled with dedications, each one a statement of wealth and influence. These treasuries lined the sacred way so that every visitor saw the power of city-states displayed side by side. The games were thus not only about the contests in the arena, but about the monuments around it, the silent but eloquent voices of cities proclaiming their greatness. The politics beneath the games remind us that sport has never been separate from society. The athletes strained their bodies in the arena, but their victories were never their own alone. Behind each stood a city eager for prestige, ready to celebrate or exploit success, ready to weave athletic glory into civic identity. The dust of Olympia was therefore not only sweat and soil, but the dust of politics, stirred by the footsteps of athletes who carried the pride of nations on their shoulders. As you drift tonight into calm reflection, picture Olympia once more. See the banners of city-states fluttering in the summer air. Hear the accents of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and countless smaller towns mingling in the crowd. Watch as athletes compete, their struggles cheered not only for themselves but for their homelands. Imagine treaties whispered in shaded corners, monuments rising along the sacred way, scandals whispered behind the roar of the crowd. Beneath the glory of the contests, beneath the dust of the arena, politics lived and thrived, making the games as much about cities as about athletes. That was the hidden truth of Olympia, that every race, every throw, every victory was a message, and every crown of olive leaves a symbol of political triumph. Imagine the arena after the dust has settled, the crowd still buzzing with excitement, and a single athlete standing apart, his body bruised, his breath ragged, but his face alight with triumph. He has outrun, outwrestled, or outlasted every rival. Now, as silence falls, an official approaches with a simple crown made from the branches of a sacred olive tree. No glittering gold, no chest of riches, no elaborate prize, just a wreath, woven by hand, fragile and light. Yet as it is placed upon his head, the valley of Olympia erupts in cheers. For this crown, though simple in form, carries a weight far greater than treasure. It is the promise of eternal memory, the reward of glory, and the beginning of a legacy that will outlast stone and flesh alike. The rewards of victory in the ancient Olympic Games were both humble and immeasurable. At Olympia itself, the prize was deliberately modest, a wreath of olive leaves, a symbol of honor untainted by material wealth. This was by design, for the games celebrated not riches but excellence, not possessions but reputation. To be crowned with olive was to be marked as the finest among men, chosen by merit alone. The crowd roared not for the object itself, but for what it meant. Proof that the victor had conquered his rivals, his body, and the expectations of thousands. But the true rewards came not in that moment alone, but in what followed. Victors returned to their city-states as heroes, streets filled with citizens who greeted them with shouts and applause. Poets composed verses in their honor. Sculptors carved statues of their likeness, and their names were inscribed into memory. Some cities opened their gates so that victors might enter not by the common roads, but through breaches made in their walls, a symbolic gesture that declared, "The man who won glory for his people needs no defense." Others granted lifelong privileges, free meals at the public expense, front row seats at festivals, exemption from taxes, and positions of influence. A single victory at Olympia could transform an ordinary man into a figure of lasting prominence. For the athletes themselves, the fame was intoxicating. They had trained in obscurity, endured pain and exhaustion, risked failure and humiliation. Now they were celebrated across Greece. Travelers carried news of their victories, spreading their names to distant cities. Poets sang of them, ensuring that their feats would be remembered long after their bodies grew old. Some victors achieved a kind of immortality, their stories surviving in chronicles that outlasted empires. Even now, millennia later, their names are recalled, proof that a wreath of olive could grant something no treasure chest could buy. Endurance and memory. Yet victory was not only glory, it was also responsibility. Victors became symbols of their cities, their conducts scrutinized, their reputations bound to civic pride. To fail in life after triumph was to tarnish not only oneself but one's homeland. Thus the reward of fame was double-edged. It elevated but also burdened. Victors bore the weight of expectation, their glory both a gift and a lifelong test. The immortality of Olympic victors reveals itself in the traces left behind. Inscriptions on stones still echo their names. Fragments of statues preserve their likenesses, and ancient texts recount their feats. These remnants show that what was truly won was not material but symbolic, the ability to live in the memory of future generations. To be remembered was the ultimate prize, to outlast the fragile span of life by becoming part of history's fabric. The simplicity of the wreath contrasted with the vastness of the reward. Its leaves withered within days, yet its meaning grew, stronger with time. Families preserved them as relics, cities honored them as symbols, poets immortalized them in verse. The crown was fragile, but the glory was not. This paradox is what made the prize so powerful. The smallest of objects carried the greatest of meanings. As you let this story settle tonight, imagine once more the victor crowned in dust and sunlight. Hear the cheers rising from thousands of throats. See the wreath placed gently on his head. Feel the weight of glory resting not on his shoulders alone, but on the pride of his entire city. Then follow him home, see the streets filled with celebration, the honors bestowed, the songs composed. Picture his name whispered in distant markets, written on stone, remembered long after his footsteps faded. That is the true reward of the ancient Olympics. Not wealth, not possession, but the fragile crown that granted immortality in memory. Imagine approaching Olympia on the morning of the games, the air already hot, the roads choked with people, the murmur of countless voices rising like a tide. Merchants shout above the crowd, offering food and drink. Musicians play flutes to earn a few coins. Children weave between legs, chasing glimpses of the action, and the dust of thousands of feet hangs in the sunlight like a haze. The stadium lies ahead, a simple stretch of earth flanked by grassy slopes. But to those arriving, it is a theater unlike any other. For the crowd, the games were not only contests of athletes, they were shared experiences, spectacles that bound people together in awe, laughter, rivalry, and memory. To be in that sea of humanity was to feel part of something larger than oneself, to sense the weight of tradition and the thrill of the moment blending into a single experience. The first impression was always the noise. Spectators filled the slopes, their voices echoing in waves. When runners crouched at the starting line, silence might fall for a moment, a collective breath held in suspense. But as soon as they surged forward, the air exploded with shouts, cheers for favorites, groans for stumbles, gasps at near collisions. The noise rolled like thunder across the valley, rising and falling with the fortunes of the contests. Wrestling matches drew steady roars, each throw greeted by cheers, while chariot races brought chaos, the crowd screaming at every turn as crashes and near misses filled the track with danger. The sound itself became part of the spectacle, a living rhythm that matched the contests unfolding before their eyes. The sight was no less overwhelming. From every hillside, spectators strained for views. They saw runners' muscles gleaming with sweat, wrestlers grappling in clouds of dust, boxers striking with fists wrapped in leather, chariots rattling past in a blur of speed. The simplicity of the arena meant that there was little distance between athlete and audience. Faces were visible, breaths audible, the rawness of effort undeniable. This closeness made the crowd participants as much as spectators, for every cheer seemed to drive athletes harder, every groan weighed upon their shoulders. To watch was to join the contest, if only through voice and presence. The smells of the games were equally vivid. Dust hung thick in the air, mingled with the sharp tang of sweat the oil athletes rubbed onto their bodies. The smoke of cooking fires where merchants prepared meals for the hungry. The aroma of bread, olives, and roasted meat drifted across the slopes, mixing with the earthy scent of trampled grass. For the crowd, the games were as much about the atmosphere as the contests. Families picnicked, friends shared food, strangers exchanged drinks, and the smells of both exertion and festivity created a sensory backdrop unlike any other gathering in Greece. Rivalries added to the intensity. Spectators came not only to watch athletes but to support their cities. Cheers for one runner were jeers for another, and victories were celebrated or mourned as civic fortunes. When an Athenian won, Athenians in the crowd erupted in joy, while Spartans sat grim-faced. When a Spartan triumphed, his supporters roared in triumph, and rivals muttered in frustration. These tensions made the crowd electric, each contest charged with political undertones. Every victory or loss carrying weight beyond the individual. Yet for all the rivalries, there was also unity. The very act of gathering tens of thousands, sitting together under the same sun, watching the same contests, sharing the same dust created a bond. For those few days, the divisions of Greece seemed to blur. People spoke to strangers, laughed with rivals, and felt themselves part of something larger, a shared identity as witnesses to Olympia. That collective experience was perhaps the greatest spectacle of all. The knowledge that one was not alone, that one's voice joined thousands in shaping the atmosphere of history. Merchants and entertainers added layers of color to the crowd. Jugglers, musicians, and storytellers worked the edges, performing for coins between contests. Stalls offered food, drink, trinkets, and souvenirs, turning the festival into both marketplace and theater. For children, these diversions were as memorable as the contests. For adults, they were welcome relief between long hours in the sun. Olympia was not only an athletic event, but a festival, a convergence of commerce, culture, and sport that made the crowd's experience as rich as the contests themselves. At times, the sheer crush of people was overwhelming. Hillsides overflowed. Spectators jostled for better views, tempers flared, yet even this became part of the atmosphere. To be there was to endure the discomfort of heat, noise, and crowding in exchange for the privilege of witnessing greatness. The hardships only deepened the memory. For years later, people recalled not only the victories they had seen, but the dust they had breathed, the sun they had endured, the voices they had joined. As you rest tonight, imagine yourself among them. Feel the press of bodies on every side, hear the roar of thousands rising in unison, see the dust swirling as runners race across the track. Smell the mingled scents of sweat, oil, and food. Taste the bread shared by companions. Sense the tension of rivalries and the warmth of fleeting unity. To be in the crowd at Olympia was to be part of something unforgettable, a spectacle not just of athletes, but of humanity itself. The contests ended, the victors crowned, the dust settled, but the memory of being there, in that living sea of voices, endured forever. Imagine the campfires burning on the hillsides around Olympia as night falls after a day of contests. Athletes rest their tired bodies, merchants count their earnings, and families share bread beneath the stars. But in the flicker of firelight, another kind of spectacle begins, the telling of stories. Poets and travelers lean forward, voices low and rhythmic, recounting tales of how the games began, why they mattered, and the legends that gave them weight. For the ancients, the Olympic Games were never only about what happened on the track or in the arena. They were bound to myths that stretched back into a timeless past. To hear these stories was to believe that each runner, each wrestler, Each victor walked in the footsteps not only of men, but of legends themselves. The myths surrounding the Olympics offered explanations, inspiration, and authority. They told audiences that the games were older than memory, founded by heroes who had conquered monsters, kings who had sought peace, or mighty figures who had once tested themselves in contests of strength. To believe these tales was to see Olympia, not just as a place of dust and sweat, but as a sacred stage where history touched eternity. These stories were not uniform. Different regions told them in different ways, but all carried the same message. The games were more than sport. They were part of a larger story about the human desire for glory, endurance, and remembrance. Some storytellers claim that the games began with ancient heroes who tested their speed and strength long before the first recorded contests. They described races held in honor of great figures, competitions that echoed deeds of bravery and victory in battles of old. Others spoke of kings who sought to unify their people through peaceful contests, creating a space where rivalries could be transformed into races rather than wars. These stories explained why truces were declared during the games, why enemies sat side by side in the crowd, why victory was celebrated not with riches, but with wreaths of honor. They gave meaning to ritual and turned tradition into legend. The myths also wove morality into the games. They told audiences that victory was not only about physical power, but about character, about endurance, discipline, and fairness. Stories warned against arrogance, showing how those who boasted too much were humbled, while the modest triumphed. They celebrated those who endured hardship, who trained with patience, who accepted defeat with dignity. In this way, myths shaped the expectations of athletes and spectators alike. They were not just entertainment, but lessons, reminders that the games reflected values as well as strength. Legends gave individual contests a cosmic dimension. When runners crouched at the starting line, audiences remembered stories of heroes who had once raced across fields for honor. When wrestlers grappled in the dust, listeners recalled tales of mighty figures whose struggles had shaken the earth. Each event echoed these older stories, and in doing so, it gained weight beyond the present. The crowd was not watching men alone. They were watching traditions that had been sanctified by legend. The stories also explained the origins of rituals. At Olympia, why olive wreaths rather than gold? Why the lighting of flames, the presence of heralds, the importance of silence before contests? Myths offered answers. They told of sacred groves where trees had been planted by ancient hands, of fires lit to honor memory, of heralds chosen to ensure fairness because even the gods, or so it was said, demanded justice in competition. These tales gave ordinary actions a depth that made them more than custom. To follow ritual was to walk in step with myth. For the crowd, these stories transformed the experience of the games. To hear them told around fires or shouted by poets in the marketplace was to feel connected to something larger, something timeless. The myths blurred the line between history and imagination, between men and legends. They ensured that every contest carried echoes of the past. Every victor stood in a line that stretched beyond human memory. As centuries passed, the myths themselves evolved, retold by poets, reshaped by regions, but always preserving the same truth, that the games were not mere contests of flesh and bone, but sacred rituals of endurance, glory, and unity. Even as the world changed, the legends endured, woven into the memory of Olympia, carried forward by each generation that gathered to watch. As you rest tonight, imagine those fires burning on the hillsides of Olympia. Hear the quiet murmur of crowds stilled by story, the rhythmic voices of poets recounting legends of heroes and kings, the gasps of children hearing tales for the first time. Picture the athletes listening too, their tired bodies eased by the knowledge that their struggles were part of something far older, far grander. In that moment, myth and reality blurred, and the Olympic Games became not only sport, but story, not only contest, but legend. That was their true magic, to unite the living with the remembered, the present with the eternal, through the power of myth and tale. Imagine standing in the valley of Olympia's centuries after the first games had been held. The air is still warm, the earth still dry and dusty, the olive trees still whisper in the breeze. But the crowds are smaller now, the merchants fewer, the athletes less numerous. The great roar of thousands that once shook the slopes has quieted into something more subdued, more fragile. The Olympic Games, once the most enduring spectacle of the Greek world, have begun to fade. Not all at once, not in a single moment of collapse, but slowly like the last embers of a fire glowing faintly before going dark. To understand why the tradition faded is to see how even the strongest customs, the most beloved rituals, can be worn down by time, change, and the shifting tides of history. For centuries, the games thrived because Greece itself thrived. The city-states, though divided and often at war, shared a culture that bound them together. Olympia became the one place where they could meet in peace, where contests replaced battles, where olive crowns replaced spears. But as time moved forward, Greece changed. Wars grew longer, rivalries sharper, and foreign powers loomed larger. The games, once symbols of unity, began to strain under the weight of division. City-states still sent athletes, still sought glory, but the spirit of collective celebration weakened. Victories became less about shared tradition and more about political advantage, the olive wreath losing some of its unifying power. The Roman conquest marked a turning point. When Rome absorbed Greece, the games did not disappear, but they changed. Romans admired Greek culture and adopted many of its traditions, including the Olympics. Yet their perspective was different. For them, contests were entertainment, often grander, more theatrical, more violent than the simple dust and sweat struggles of Olympia. The games were preserved but reshaped, competing for attention with Roman spectacles and vast amphitheaters, chariot races in Circus Maximus, gladiatorial, combats in the Colosseum. These dazzled crowds in ways Olympia's humble arena could not. The Olympics remained, but they were no longer the unrivaled stage of glory they once had been. Over time, the games suffered from neglect and corruption. Records tell of scandals multiplying, of athletes bribed, of victories tainted. The ideals of discipline and honor eroded, replaced by ambition for reward and influence. Spectators still gathered, but the magic weakened. Olympia itself, once sacred in memory and symbol, became just another site of contests, less central to a world now shaped by larger empires and shifting cultures. Natural disasters played their role too. Earthquakes shook the valley, floods from rivers buried tracks in silt, and time itself eroded monuments. Each disaster chipped away at the physical heart of Olympia, making it harder to sustain the games in their old form. Where once crowds filled the slopes, now fewer came. The site, itself scarred and fragile. The decline was not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, each blow further dimming the light that had once burned so brightly by the late centuries. The games were shadows of their former selves. Athletes still ran, wrestled, and fought, but the world around them had moved on. The city-states that once made victories meaningful were long absorbed into larger empires. The crowds that once traveled across Greece found other diversions, other spectacles, other stages for their ambitions. Olympia's voice, once loud enough to echo across centuries, grew faint. The wreath of olive leaves still crowned victors, but fewer cared, fewer remembered. What makes the end of the games so poignant is that they did not vanish in disgrace or destruction, but in silence. They faded slowly, absorbed by time, outpaced by change, forgotten by a world that no longer needed them as it once had. For nearly 1,000 years they had endured, surviving wars, rivalries, and the rise of empires. But nothing, not even tradition so deeply rooted, is eternal dot, and yet, though the games themselves faded, their legacy never fully disappeared. Stories of victors survived in stone inscriptions, poets' verses endured, and ruins at Olympia whispered of past glory. Later generations, centuries removed, looked back with fascination, imagining the dust, the sweat, the cheers. The memory of the games remained alive in imagination long after the contests themselves had ceased. As you let your thoughts settle tonight, imagine standing once more in that quiet valley after the last games had been held. The dust lies undisturbed. The olive trees still sway in the breeze, but the stadium is silent. No crowds cheer, no runners surge forward, no wrestlers grapple in the sand. Only memory remains, lingering in the air, woven into the earth, whispering of the centuries when this place was alive with glory. The end of the ancient Olympics was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of their legacy, a legacy so powerful that centuries later they would be reborn in new form, remembered as the greatest contests of the ancient world. The dust of Olympia has long since settled, its stadium silent, its slopes overgrown, its ruins scattered by time. Yet when we close our eyes, we can still hear the distant echo of bare feet pounding across the packed earth, the roar of thousands, rising with every surge of effort, the rattle of chariot wheels turning dangerously on the curves. The games that began in simplicity endured for centuries, carrying with them not only contests of strength and speed, but stories of politics, legends, and glory. Their end came quietly, absorbed by history's tide, but their memory refused to fade. The ancient Olympics were never just about athletes. They were about the journey of entire peoples, the city-states that sent champions, the crowds who gathered, the poets who sang, the victors who became immortal in memory. They embodied endurance, ambition, and the strange blend of unity and rivalry that defined Greece. Even as the olive wreath withered, the glory it represented grew brighter, passed down through story, song, and stone. Tonight, as we finish this long journey, imagine Olympia not as ruins, but as it once was, alive with dust, sweat, sound, and anticipation. See the athletes crouched at the line, the wrestlers grappling in sand, the chariots racing in thunderous speed. Hear the voices of spectators, the whispers of poets, the breath of victors crowned with fragile leaves that promised immortality. Though the games ended, their spirit endured. They remind us that glory is not measured in gold or monuments, but in memory and meaning. They remind us that even the simplest rituals, repeated with devotion, can outlast empires. And they remind us that history is never truly gone. It lingers in stories, in ruins, in the imagination of those who keep listening. And so we close the tale of the ancient Olympic Games, a story of dust and endurance, of glory and scandal, of triumphs that have outlived time itself. May its echoes carry you into rest, like the soft hum of distant voices on a summer evening, whispering of a world where men once ran for immortality. Good night.